Thank you for asking me to speak today. I'm really impressed that the six cathedrals have collaborated to put on such a comprehensive event, and I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I speak today as CEO of Rocha UK, but I also speak as somebody with a lifelong passion for the environment and social justice, and also as a lifelong churchgoer. I grew up in a vicarage, and my wife and my son are now both ordained ministers in the Anglican Church. I'm the one who got away so far without a dog collar, but I hope I have some experience and some understanding of the normal life of a local church for both laity and clergy, the challenges as well as the joys. Now, post-COVID, at a time of excruciating cost of living rise, with new refugee waves coming out of the horror of Ukraine, never mind dropping church congregations as a result of COVID, we do have huge challenges in local churches. However, we also know that we have a double biblical mandate to act on climate change, both for caring for creation and because of the need to love our neighbour, both instructed by the Bible, by the Lord Jesus, to do that. Now, this impels us to respond to climate change, a truly existential threat for people and nature. However, I'm actually excited, despite this huge challenge, about what God seems to be calling the churches to do in this realm. The more I get into it, the more I think churches and Christians have unique assets to contribute to this global challenge of averting catastrophic climate change. In addition, concerted action by the church will inevitably support the wider mission of the church itself. For example, pointing people towards a loving God, serving the poor and the vulnerable, challenging the structures of injustice. And that really excites me too. There are huge co-benefits for the church as well as society of acting on climate change. So in the next few minutes, I want to share a few thoughts about our assets, how we can get the best from what we've got to tackle climate change. But I want to start by grounding us in two key elements of reality as I see it: where climate change is at and where the churches are at on climate change. So let me look at where climate change is at. Well, as I'm sure many of you know, the scientific advice adopted by the 2015 Paris Climate Summit was to try to hold temperature change to as close to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average as we possibly can. Since that summit, however, we've already passed the 1.1 degree mark, and we're heading for 2.5 and beyond unless we change course very fast. This will make large parts of the world uninhabitable with catastrophic impacts for people and nature. So, the number one reality that global society, including the worldwide church, needs to grasp is the extreme urgency of bold action. So, in their latest report in April, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said this: limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. Even if we do this, it is almost inevitable that we will temporarily exceed this temperature threshold, but could return to below it by the end of the century, if we do the right things fast enough, implied. That's really scary, isn't it? I find it so, I'm sure you do. But as Christians and churches trying to be salt and light in a broken world, we need to grasp it and allow the facts to focus our hearts and our minds and our prayer life and our actions on what God is calling us to be and do in this situation. The good news, the better news, is that we do know what the solutions are, big picture. First of all, get off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy and energy efficiency. Get off a high meat diet, high meat and dairy diet, and onto a more balanced one with more plant-based foods, which would be healthier for us anyway. Stop destroying our carbon sinks, the forests, the grasslands, the wetlands, and so on, and start regenerating them. And of course, use less stuff and get more enjoyment from much more eternal things than just buying the next car or iPhone. So we know what we need to do. So what's the church context? Where are the churches on climate change now and these kinds of actions? Well, we all know that we must do much more and much faster. But that's also true of every other sector of society. What actually is very exciting to me is how far we've come in recent years and what that might tell us about how we could go much further, faster. As a Christian working professionally on climate change for more than 20 years now, I've witnessed an absolute sea change in Christians and churches engaging with the issue. In about 2000, when I and my team at Tier Fund, where I was then advocacy director, set up the climate change program there, it was met with mystification by many churches and actual opposition from some. Fortunately, I had a bold and visionary boss who had my back, and the work went ahead and flourished. It's still going strong, as I'm sure you're aware. But now, 20 years later, all the main historic denominations and many new streams of church are engaging in climate change. Around the country, local churches are taking action in unprecedented numbers. A scheme close to me, Eco Church. We have more than 5,000 churches registered with it now in England and Wales, and our sister organisations, Eco Congregation Scotland, Eco Congregation Ireland, are also doing great guns. In the year 2020, 2 years ago, the Church of England committed to reaching net zero by 2030, setting a lead which other denominations are following, and you'll soon have a route map. And in 2021, last year, more than 2,200 churches right across the denominations and across Great Britain and Ireland took part in Climate Sunday in the approach to COP26, the biggest UK Christian mobilisation around climate change we've ever seen. These examples are evidence of a fundamental change in awareness, attitude and action by churches on climate change. We should take heart that that can happen and ask ourselves how we make it happen now much faster. So how can we bring about that faster change? I suggest three broad areas. I think the first thing we need to do is to understand our assets, what we have got as Christians and churches that can be used on this issue, and then seek to deploy them all. And I believe Christians and churches as a sector of UK society have some incredible assets, unique and powerful inheritance. First of all, there's our relationship with the Creator God through worship and prayer to sustain us in increasingly tough times, and our double mandate for action to motivate us. Then there's our buildings and churchyards, tangible physical assets which we can manage in order to cut our own carbon emissions directly, for example by switching to a green energy provider and many other things. And even small patches of land in our churchyards where we can create mini carbon sinks by, for example, sowing a wildflower meadow, and so on. Then there's our national presence. There are 50,000 self-defined churches in the UK. Not everyone with a building and a churchyard, but groups, worshipping congregations in every village, town and city neighbourhood. What huge potential to demonstrate God's love for his creation and to serve and influence whole communities at the same time. Then there's our numbers, 3 million regular churchgoers, even if that has been dented by COVID. We are way more numerous than most other parts of civil society. And there's more, isn't there? From denominational financial investments and pension funds, major land holdings of the church commissioners and some dioceses, our political voice at a national level with MPs in political parties at Parliament, 26, I believe it is, Anglican bishops in the House of Lords, our international linkages, communication networks, you name it. We've got such a variety of assets that we can bring to the table on this urgent challenge. What if even a quarter of us, local churches and Christians, started to care practically for the environment as fully as we are able in our home, in our street, in our church? What if even a quarter of us started to speak up regularly in campaigns to urge the government or businesses to go much further faster on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on regenerating the UK's carbon sinks? What if every year, not just on the occasional year, all denominations and Christian charities united in a bold campaign to urge the government to make a great leap forward and to object to any steps backwards, such as exploiting new fossil fuel sources in the UK? This can have an absolutely game-changing effect on the speed and fairness with which the UK cuts our carbon emissions, not just on the church's emissions. Why would we not want to do that? I think we are called to try. Now, the second way we can accelerate our change and wider impact is to work very intentionally to learn from each other's failures and successes. We've got so many great examples here in the east of England alone, from cathedrals to village churches, too many for me to recount now. But let me just give you two examples. First, Chelmsford Cathedral, which, as some of you will know, has achieved the Gold Eco Church Award. They've made big changes to further sustainability right across the estate and to help achieve the cathedral's pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030. These include everything from ending the use of disposable cups and plates, the installation of LED bulbs in the cathedral, motion sensing sensor lighting, and critically switching to a renewable energy provider for electricity. A second example is All Saints Church Barrow, which was awarded Eco Church Silver last year. They're a good example of what can be done on land and biodiversity. Good for nature, good for improving carbon retention, great for local demonstration and involving the local community. By changing the mowing regime at church, for example, they have created a great habitat for insects, small mammals and birds, but also a great environment for kids to learn, connect to nature and have fun. So now, with longer grass and less mowing, they can safely introduce hedgehogs into the churchyard. Swift boxes have been installed on the rectory, and 2 local churches are putting them up too. Thus, they're providing support for 2 once common species which are now in steep decline in the UK, in part because of lack of habitat and breeding sites. In parenthesis, both species are included in a Rocha UK's Target 25 project, where we're asking the public, particularly our supporters and churches, to help us turn around the fortunes of 25 endangered species and habitats in this country. All Saints Barrow has also been engaging the local community by running an eco trail for school kids and their teachers, strengthening not just their knowledge of God's creation, but also their own local links. So there are hundreds and hundreds of inspiring examples of what churches are doing across the UK. More than 1,000 churches have reached at least Eco Church Bronze, almost 300 have reached Silver, and 18, including 2 cathedrals, have reached Gold. Between us, we really do have a treasure trove of knowledge, experience, skills, and innovative abilities. So an important next step, I believe, for each and every one of us, whatever church or role we are in, is to find our own regular learning community and become very intentional about exchanging experiences of what works and how to get around blockages. So that forum could be, that community could be, a deanery one or a diocesan one, a local churches together group, or the spaces we provide in the Eco Church programme, including the Eco Church Connect Bulletin and thematic webinars. It could be a Rocha UK's Wild Christian community for individuals and households that you can sign up to free online. But being part of an intentional learning community is not just good for spreading good practice fast, it's vital for many of us psychologically to get some peer support and inspiration to keep us going over the next years. And we do need to look after ourselves and others in this marathon. The third and last thing I want to mention, a way that we can speed up change, is by imagining new roles for the local church consistent with our God-given mission and with the emerging needs that we can see, and then piloting how to bring those about. We are now in uncharted territory in terms of climate impacts. As the decade goes by, the UK will be more likely to suffer from serious coastal flooding, killer heat waves affecting people and crops, and therefore food prices, and widespread eco-anxiety, particularly among our young people. There will be new needs, and we will want to respond to them pastorally as well as practically. Could a couple of churches per diocese, for example, experiment with becoming resource centres for local climate resilience? Could they provide a forum for local society to formulate and coordinate joint plans to deal with the growing impacts of climate change, as well as spreading the means by which we carry on cutting carbon emissions and restoring our local carbon sinks? And could they hold the ring for the voices of the poor and the most vulnerable to be heard and acted upon, to make sure that this necessary transition to a low carbon economy is not just fast, but is fair as well? I think we can do that. I would love to hear your ideas of the roles that the church could play as we see these needs emerging. But to round up now, we know from the science that time is perilously short to avoid triggering climate catastrophe. The challenge before society is genuinely unprecedented. It requires whole sectors of society to move, and fast, and for governments to use their unique powers of lawmaking and national budgets to drive change. But Christians and churches, we have our own unique assets too. If we understand the whole array of the assets God has given us for this task, if we work together to share what we learn, and if we dare to imagine church for a century of climate disruption, we can reach net zero ourselves. But not only that, we can play a critical role in leadership and influencing in getting the UK itself back on track to meet our national climate targets, and in a way that's fair to the poorest and the most vulnerable. And that itself would set an inspiring international example in this global race to avoid catastrophe. I'm sorry I can't be with you for the rest of the day, and I really look forward to catching up on the discussions when I can. But as you drop down to some real nitty-gritty in the sessions that follow, very necessarily, do keep an eye on the big picture of this possible prize if we acknowledge our assets and use them all. And get, I would say, legitimately fanatical about exchanging what works in those conference rooms, in the chat stream. But let's go for it and really exchange what works, how we can use everything God has given us, and how we can influence wider society by doing that. Thank you.